Well, good morning. My name is Alex Fernandez. I'm the pastor here at the Heritage Hill campus. I'm so glad that you've joined us here today. If you're here or if you're watching online, welcome in. I'll just start off with a question. I love starting off with a question. What's the greatest physical pain you've ever been in? Think about that for a second. I've never had a broken bone, so I don't know what that feels like. Never given birth. I don't know what that feels like. So whatever comes to your mind, I want you to think about that greatest pain you've ever been in. I've never given birth, but I'll tell you what, a few years ago, I had an episode. This happened so long ago, I was talking to Beth Ann about it and she totally forgot, but it has scarred my life. And so I had an episode where I woke up at like 5 a.m. with like shooting pains in my stomach. And it got so severe that I had to get up out of bed, and I was sitting in my living room, and it would just come on and it would just shoot, right? It would just shoot from here, and I could feel it from head to toe. And it was giving me anxiety. I'm like, what's going on with my body? I felt pressure in my chest. And so I did what everybody does. I started to Google things. And that didn't help my situation, right? You Google shooting pain in your stomach and chest and watch what comes up. You know, I'm all of a sudden diagnosing myself with all sorts, like, do I have cancer? Am I having a heart attack? And this proceeded for a good couple hours. So much so that I needed to go into urgent care because I was concerned. And so I go to urgent care and they hook me up. They're checking my blood pressure. They're checking my pulse. They're doing like EKG. They're doing everything, you know? And I'm like, it's never happened to me before. I'm all concerned. And the doctor came back and he said, you have gas. I prefer to call it irritable bowel syndrome. That's just, you know. But I just had a bad case of gas, but it was excruciating pain. I promise you, I thought I was dying. I'm out there, aren't I? I just put stuff out there. Watch this transition. As I walk with families at Cornerstone, and as I just walked as a pastor with people throughout the years, two words that have given the greatest amount of pain to families are the words adultery and divorce. If those two words have crept into a family and a relationship, I don't need to tell you how much damage those two words cause. If you're a child who has grown up in an environment where those words have crept in, that has a lasting impact. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you see parents split apart or whatnot, that has a tremendous impact, and it comes with pain. And so today we're hitting a couple topics that I will just make a note that the church has not handled well throughout its history. The church has done a disservice to these two topics because when it comes to human sexuality in churches, we have kind of avoided this topic. We haven't really provided good guidance for people over the years. We just kind of sweep it under the rug and we don't talk about it very often, you know. Got to keep it out of your mind. Like, close your eyes right now. Don't think of a pink elephant, right? That doesn't work. You start thinking of the pink elephant. So just sweeping it under the rug, pretending it doesn't exist, doesn't work. And also, you know, the church has done a lot of damage to people, and people have carried a lot of guilt because of those words. And so I preface that by also saying that before we start thinking about that person we know, or about that person who we blame when these two topics come up, as we learned last week and as we looked at the word murder, that Jesus has a redefinition of the words that we're looking at in his Sermon on the Mount, and that's where we are. That has a far greater definition than what our minds go to. And so if you're joining us, we are in Matthew chapter 5 in this series called Redefined. We are studying Jesus's maybe the most important sermon ever preached, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, And to give you an idea where we've been just for a few weeks, he starts off with the Beatitudes, the blessed comments, and he's giving us an image, a vision of what it looks like, what the characteristics of a Jesus follower, what are the characteristics that they have. He also talks about that we are to be salt and light in the world, that it's not just about us, that it's about how we live. And then as we move through chapter 5, as we're talking last week and as we continue this week, he's giving us some case studies around some commandments and laws, because these are going to help us understand, how do I live this out? What does it look like? And I say case studies, they're examples. They're not the most important commandments necessarily, but he's using them as an example because he wants us and the people of that day to wrestle with the question, what is the kind of life that lives up to the deepest intent of these commandments? In other words, beyond just following the letter of the law, what does it look like to honor this commandment in spirit? It's not just following the letter of the law, but what is this trying to help you, shape you, and become? And last week we started off with this idea that the purpose of following Jesus' commands is to become the kind of human God intends us to be. That God's commands aren't there to make us feel guilty. They're not there to create a rigid life. They're not there to have a life that's not fun, but they're there to help shape us. And so today we're going to hit 3 in chapter 5. And they're adultery, divorce, and oath-making, which seems like a strange one, but Jesus is going to tie it all together, and you'll understand, I hope, by the end. And I'll just make another note here that I really recommend that you take a listen, if you haven't already, to our what we call our BTW podcast. It's our Beyond the Weekend, because there's so much content, guys, in these stories and chapters that there's not enough time on a Sunday morning to go deep into it. And we try to bring you that deeper content in our podcast. They come out every Tuesday. You can find them where the messages are. And last week we talked about murder, and I went into detail in our BTW podcast. I was at our 84th Street campus. Ken was here, and the topic was murder, and I'll just tell you, it was a killer message. It was, wow. Okay. If you didn't get that, somebody will explain it to you on the way home. So adultery and divorce. And so if murder didn't make you uncomfortable, you're probably sitting on pins and needles today, right? Okay, so let's jump in. And the pattern that we're going to see Jesus go through each one of these case studies or examples, he follows the same pattern. He tells us, what does the Torah say? The Torah is a reminder. First 5 books of the Bible in our Christian Bible, they are the scriptures for a Jewish person. In them are the stories of creation, the stories of the patriarchs, but in them are the 613 laws that help you understand how to honor God and whatnot. And so Jesus is going to use each one of them, and he's going to bring up, what does the Torah say? And then he's going to tell us what he says about that. And then he's going to help us understand, what does it look like to live this out, or give us some instructions. And so let's just jump in. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, Jesus says, "You have heard the commandment that says," here's the Torah, "you must not commit adultery." So what does Jesus say? He says, "But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into the fiery pit. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into the fiery pit." Torah. No adultery. Jesus. Don't even lust. Now, lust, I will tell you, has taken a powerful role in our society. With the rise in access to pornography, kids who are exposed to things like that continues to affect younger and younger people. I'll just throw some statistics at you to give us some perspective. The pornography industry generates about $15 billion of revenue a year. That's as much as the NFL for you sports fans. It's more than NBA, it's more than the Major League Baseball generates in revenue. Which is fascinating because a lot of pornography these days is free. It's out there. Which helps us understand that as somebody falls into this trap, there's a limit that they continue to want to go to that maybe the previous didn't satisfy. And this has been talked about as a male issue, but here's some other statistics. Romance novels, which continue to get more graphic, generate about $1.4 billion a year. The 50 Shades franchise generated $570 million. There's a rabbit hole that you can fall into in your TikTok and Reel worlds of influencers who are trying to get your attention. And if you're not careful, pretty soon it's littered with what kind of content you're seeing, each one becoming more provocative than the other. And if we go back to the text, I will point out two things that are really important in the text, because the key word in the text is not just lust. It's actually the word look. And you might wonder, well, why is looking a problem? And the problem comes in with the definition of the word look in the text. Because the word look in the text means to gaze. It's not just a glance, it's to gaze or to stare in a way that you want to take something that doesn't belong to you. That's the definition of the word look in this text. It's to look at something that doesn't belong to you and make it into an object of your desire. We might call that covet. And the word lust in the text is the Greek word epithumeo, which is not a bad word. It just means to long for. And when Jesus is about to have the Last Supper with his disciples, it says Jesus epithumeo for the time to have the Last Supper. He longed for that moment. But when you take those two words in and connect them together, to take something that doesn't belong to you and to long for it, you connect those two thoughts, it's a stare that dehumanizes and it devalues a person. It makes them an object. And as we learned before, Jesus points out that it's not just good enough to not break the commandment of a physical sin. Honoring it is much more than that. And there's a reason he's talking about this topic in his sermon. There's actually a reason he's talking about all these topics in his sermon. And it's because how people, including religious leaders of the day, were interpreting this commandment. For them, it was simple. Do not commit adultery. But what did that mean? In the Old Testament, in the time of Jesus, adultery, and we have to understand this is the context of that day. This is Jewish culture, so it's talked about as a man and a woman. We live in a different time, but it's talking about adultery is simply a married man who has relationship with a married woman. That was adultery. Read into that. That means if a married man had a relationship with a single woman, it was an adultery. It was wrong, maybe, but it wasn't violating this commandment. That's going to be important as we look at the next one here in a little bit. And so even the teachers of the law of that day were bending the law, and Jesus redefines it. And then he gives us some instructions. So what do? He says, well, gouge your eye out or cut off your hand. Pretty simple. What Jesus is using here is what he used in his previous teaching on murder, and he's using hyperbole or exaggeration to make his point that lust is so powerful and dangerous that you may have to take drastic measures. In other words, if you need to sacrifice something to get that under control, it would be worth doing whatever you have to do because it's more dangerous and damaging than gouging out your eye and cutting off your hand. See, the teachers of the law were about obeying the command. Are you married? Are you married? Don't do that. That honors God. Jesus says, no. That doesn't compute. When you dishonor somebody, when you devalue somebody, when you make people an object of your desire, and you dehumanize them, and even if they don't know it, it doesn't matter. You're not living up to what this commandment is about. It's leading you down a dangerous path. And that's true for single people too. You know, if you're caught up in lust before you're in a relationship with somebody, you're going to carry that into that relationship if you don't deal with it. And Jesus says you need to deal with it because there's something going on in your heart about how you see people. If you make them objects, you're devaluing that person. That's adultery. Let's move on to divorce because they're connected. Verse 31, Jesus says, it has been said. Again, he's going back to a commandment. Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim, important word, will come to it, of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. I mentioned it earlier, but there's a lot of people walking around our midst who are feeling the burden of broken relationships that have ended up in divorce. A lot of people walk around with a feeling like they have a scarlet letter on their chest. I was talking to somebody before the service that said, I would have been asked to leave my church had I not come to Cornerstone because I was divorced. And the way they viewed divorce meant that I couldn't be part of that church anymore. There's others who walk around and they walk around with shame because, you know, the stigma of divorce. You know, how are people looking at me? How am I being judged? Some people walk around as if they've disappointed God because we read texts like this and we think that somehow we've disappointed God, that we've committed a sin. And again, we have to understand the context of what is happening in this day. Because in the first century, there was a debate about divorce. That's why they were talking about it. It's why Jesus brings it up. Because the Torah actually allows divorce. He's talking about an obscure passage that is found in Deuteronomy 24, and he's bringing it up. And the passage simply says that if you're a man and you want to divorce your wife, here's the stipulation. It says this: if that person becomes displeasing to you because you find something indecent about her, it's okay to divorce. Boy, let me look at the vagueness in that. Let me interpret that for you. If there's something that you don't find pleasing anymore, you have to give that person a certificate of divorce and then it's okay. Now, the woman couldn't do that. Didn't matter if the woman found anything displeasing about her husband, but the law, this obscure law that was given to Moses, was stipulated that divorce, there was a way out of relationship. So there wasn't a debate about whether you could divorce or you couldn't divorce. The debate was around what constitutes anything. And Jesus is addressing a messed up system. In fact, we really never really get underneath exactly what Jesus' view on marriage is. The closest thing we get is a few chapters later in Matthew chapter 19, where it says the Pharisees and the teachers of the law come to Jesus to test him and trap him, and they ask him about this law. And they say, Jesus, what does anything mean? Are you okay with that? And Jesus goes into his Jesus mode and he talks about, in the beginning, God created people and they were meant to be in unions with one another and there was good. And they're like, yeah, but all that, well, what do you say? Why then we get a commandment about divorce. Why was Moses given this law? And Jesus responds in verse 8. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. See, the reason he's talking about this is because people are always looking for loopholes. And Jesus is saying, quit looking for loopholes. You know, is murder when I kill somebody, or is it with intent? And does it matter if it's voluntary or is it involuntary? Or what if it's justified? Is that murder, Jesus? Or adultery? Is adultery when it actually happens? Or what if you just mess around a little bit? Or is it still adultery if we kiss? Is it adultery if it's just flirtation at work? And Jesus says, look, man, there is not a book thick enough that I could write with all the instructions, because you clowns will come up with a loophole for anything. So let me make this simple for you. Murder is when you treat people and you dehumanize them. And adultery is when you make people an object and you devalue them. And when it comes to divorce, I mean, the questions we should be asking is not what's allowed. The question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is this commandment trying to help me live up to? When it comes to divorce, in the ancient world, the women had few options for protection and provision. And without a certificate, without being given a certificate of divorce, it was not only cruel, but it would condemn them to a life of desperation and survival, because they could not remarry. Why? Because if they didn't have that certificate of divorce and they entered into another relationship with a married man, they are committing adultery. And Jesus is saying the point is to honor the relationships that you go into. Live in a way that honors these relationships. And he actually says there's reasons why these relationships fall apart. He gives one example: sexual immorality. That might be an example of what breaks that bond apart. And that breaks some families apart. And there's some families that work that out. But he also uses the word victim in there. That's an important word in this text because of what he's talking about. Because you often might find yourselves in a relationship where you're being victimized. That could be abuse, verbal. It could be abuse, physical. It could be just a dishonoring and the breaking of trust that doesn't honor a person. And this certificate was a way to rule over women in that day, in that culture, to keep them in line. Like, if I don't give you this certificate, I can go out and do whatever I want to do. And along comes Jesus, the redefiner, and he says, no, that's not how citizens of my kingdom behave. And he rejects that men don't have any accountability. And he rejects that relationships like marriage should just be tossed away without any care on a whim. And he sides with the woman in both of these texts, who are powerless to protect them so that they aren't devalued and treated as a person who has no worth. Why? Because as humans, we have a tendency to not stay loyal to God, and we have a tendency to not stay loyal to one another. And it leaves collateral damage. It leaves a wake behind us. So what honors God? It's got to be the question, right? Verse 33. Now he's talking about oaths. And it's kind of in a riddle. We're going to read this and you're going to say, what did that mean? I'm going to do my best to break it down. This is connected. He said, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. So what does the Torah say? It says, do not break an oath. if you enter into an agreement with somebody, marriage or other things, if you promise to buy land, if you enter into contract, it says don't break that oath. And Jesus says, don't make an oath at all. Don't do that. Do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to do is say simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. It's kind of a strange way to say this. But the religious leaders of that day had created a corrupted system, a janky system of oath-taking. Now, for us, we have to put ourselves in that mindset. That was a big deal, okay? Making an oath to a person was a big deal. So we have to put ourselves into that context. And they broke it down to a non-binding oath is something that you would swear to by, things not of God, not God, right? We actually say this. I swear on my life. I swear on my mother's grave. Those are examples. Those are non-binding oaths that if you swore on those regular things, you could maybe break your oath. But if you swore by God, that was binding. I swear to God. Oh, okay, now you're bringing God's name into that. That's a binding contract. That sounds weird to us, but I will tell you, we learned this at a young age. We do the same thing. You ever listen to this phrase? You finish it. Cross my heart and hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye. What does that phrase mean? We learned this as a kid. It means that what I'm saying to you right now, you can hold me to. Let me do this right now. I'm going to take you all out for lunch on me after the service. Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. What is the only way that isn't binding? Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. See, we've done that, right? We've done that. We learned that at a young age. Fingers crossed. It's a way to manipulate somebody into getting what you want. It's a way to be deceptive, right? One of them's binding, one of them's not. That's what they're debating in that day. And Jesus is saying, don't do any of that. Don't bring my name into your mess. Don't do that. Why? Because our nature is to trust people. But it's also human nature to be deceptive and manipulative to get what you want. And so Jesus says, don't make any oaths at all. Just be a person who says yes or no. In other words, be a person whose word has integrity. Be a person whose word means something. Be a person of honor. Just do that. Do that in your thoughts. Do that in your actions. Do that in your words. So Jesus walks us through 3 case studies. And the wrong way to listen to these is to think that this is a message just for married people, or it's a message just for people who have gone through divorce. But Jesus is shining a big, bright light on all of our relationships that we hold close and dear. He is shining a bright light. And the warning last week was, be careful. Don't dehumanize others. Careful. Murder is more than just murder. Being angry and getting rage get a hold of you and getting out of control, that's not good. Slandering people and gossiping about people, that's not good. Insulting people, that's all bad. And this week, he's saying he's going to tighten the screws a little bit. And he's saying, careful, don't devalue people. Honor your word. Be a person of integrity. And if I think back to my wedding vows, Beth Ann and I are going to be married 28 years in a couple weeks. Okay. I did the math. That's about 10,000 days. And I would say I have not honored my vows several thousand times in those years. There's been many days where I have treated her in a way that she didn't feel cherished. There are days, many days, where I always haven't been truthful. There are countless days that I didn't treat her gently and with respect. There are many days where my eyes and thoughts betrayed me. And I would bet that if I sat down with each and every one of you and I looked at the story of your life, there's probably moments in your life, many, where you devalued and dehumanized people in the way that you treated them. That you weren't faithful in the entire spirit of a being. That you broke off commitments that you've made with one another and wrote people off. We all fall short. So why did Jesus give us these commands? Why these specifically? It's not to feel guilty, guys. The purpose of following Jesus' commands is to become the kind of human God intends for us to be, so that we value and honor the relationships that we have been given. The relationships that we have been given are some of the most precious gifts that God could ever give us. Whether it's a spouse or a sibling or a parent or a child, a best friend, a relationship that you have been given is the most precious gift that God could give you. And he says, treat it as if it's precious. Treat those relationships like a gift. And so in those moments where maybe we feel bored and our mind starts to wander, and maybe those be moments that remind us of the relationships we're in. If you're in a relationship and it's just hit a monotony and a staleness to it, may it be a reminder to invest into that, to date your partner. It's one of the mistakes most people make in marriage is they stop dating each other. If you find yourself in a situation where conflict is part of a relationship, may we be a people who fight not for victory in those battles, but fight for resolution if we can. May we work through hard things the best that we can. If work is prying us away from our commitments, may it be a reminder to invest in our family and carve out time for our families back home. Because why? These are all precious gifts. And our human nature is our tendency to not stay loyal to God and not stay loyal to one another. And so Jesus is walking us through these guys, not as a reason for us to feel guilty, but to protect us, to encourage us, to help us realize what we've been given, and we treat one another in a way that people might look at how we treat one another and they say, tell me about the God that you know. Tell me about how did you mend that with that person. So Jesus says simply, protect your eyes, guys. Guard your heart. Watch what you say. Because if you honor the most precious things that you've been given, your relationships will flourish just as God intended. Another heavy message. Not for the faint of heart. But it's because God wants what's best for us. And so let's just enter into a time of prayer. And so, Lord, we just lift up these words here today. Lord, may they just be words that serve as a reminder for us of those relationships that we have. Maybe it's the person sitting next to us that we haven't invested enough time with, that we've let just the monotony of life slip into. And so, Lord, may it be a reminder about how important that is. Lord, that as we enter into conflict with one another, we're not going to be absent of conflict. We're people just like everybody else. But Lord, may your spirit of resolution, if possible, help mend those relationships, but make us feel whole. And if it doesn't, Lord, that we don't walk around with a scarlet letter of guilt because we've somehow disappointed you. No, Lord, it may help us as we enter into the next one. And we may not see ourselves as a person of no worth or carrying around guilt, that relationship, the next one can flourish. So Lord, let us be a people of integrity. That we not try to manipulate one another and trying to get whatever it is we want, but Lord, that our yes be yes and our no be no, that we be honest with one another, that we honor each other, that we value people, that we care about how we treat them. And Lord, may all of that bring us to a place that we just not only value, but that our relationships that we care about the most flourish. You're a good God. We receive your mercy and forgiveness and grace, and Lord, may we give that to one another. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.